Uh, Hello, everyone. My name is Sawa Tesfaye Johannes. I have special guest for you today, Tom Gardner, who will be speaking to us about the latest book, the Abiy Project: God, Power, and War in the New Ethiopia. So I'm going to be introducing you shortly, but let me say welcome to Tom. Tom, thank you very much for being here at Satellite Television, ERISAT. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me on. Appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. So I know Tom is not a stranger for many of you, especially for our audience, but I will go ahead and then briefly introduce who he is. Tom Gardner moved to Ethiopia in Addis Ababa in 2016 as the Economist Horn of Africa correspondent. He covered Ethiopia during its most tumultuous years in decades, traveling to all corners of the country before his expulsion by the Abiy Ahmed government at the height of the Tigray War in 2022. Since 2024, Tom has been the Economist's Africa correspondent based in Nairobi, Kenya. Welcome again, Tom. So just to start off our conversation about your book, and then for our audience, I think many of our audience probably have read the book. Tom has written this amazingly a comprehensive book about Abiy and his project since becoming the Ethiopian Prime Minister. So first, let me start by asking you, what made you interested in writing about Abiy and his government and his premiership in Ethiopia?
Well, actually, really early on in Abiy's tenure, I realized that I wanted to write about the transformations underway in Ethiopia. I didn't initially think it was going to be specifically about Abiy, and I would say it still isn't just about Abiy. The book is more than a biography of Abiy. It is a chronicle of this, which is what I wanted to write. But it certainly, when I began in thinking about it in late 2018, even as early as that, I was thinking in terms of this revolution that was underway in Ethiopia, and I thought, this is clearly a momentous historic moment in Ethiopian history, and I'm very, very fortunate to be here and to have the job of covering it. But I wanted to really delve into the details of what was happening as much as I could, which meant I felt I had to go beyond the confines of just writing news stories and go really in depth, which is what I decided to do. But it was only later in the process, really not until 2022, 2023, that I decided I wanted to focus on the figure of Abiy. And I think that's because, well, for two reasons. One is I think he is, love him or loathe him, he's an extraordinarily compelling figure. I think everyone finds him to some degree inscrutable, enigmatic, colorful, controversial. He is all those things. He is, as I write in the book, he's a very confounding figure. He's very hard to understand exactly what it is that guides him, or exactly what it is he believes, and certainly what is he going to do next. I think we've all been taken by surprise at pretty much every turn. So in that respect, I think most people would agree he's a kind of worthy subject of study. I also think kind of more analytically, you can't really understand the last few years of Ethiopian history without trying to understand the figure of Abiy. I'm all for saying that history you need to look at structures and economics and all these impersonal forces, for sure. But I also think the personal figure of Abiy, you can't really understand the last few years of Ethiopian history without understanding who Abiy is and what does he want. I mean, I think the last 6 years would have looked very different without Abiy in the picture. This is, for better or worse, this is the Abiy era. So that's why I wanted to write about it.
I think it's very interesting. I think you are right about that. I think Abiy Ahmed was able to sort of take everybody by kind of his spell, to say the least. I mean, everybody from Western governments, from African governments, of course, Ethiopians, and including Eritreans for the most part. That I think the image or the personality that he created was it's incredibly different. I mean, so how do you compare him? I know you write in depth about his as compared to the previous regime in Ethiopia, EPRDF, and whatever have you. So how do you compare him, Abiy? I mean, you can even go farther beyond the EPRDF of Ethiopia. So is he some sort of a new kind of new leadership, a new style, new era of Ethiopian reformist, or is that's how he was portrayed at the beginning? So how do you describe Abiy in comparison to his previous counterparts in Ethiopia or in the region, for that matter?
I mean, in certain ways, he is the inheritor of a tradition in kind of Ethiopian statecraft and leadership, that kind of imperial style and approach. I think it's in many ways, and I say this in the book, he harkens back to the kind of Christian emperor of Ethiopia, you know, whether we're talking about Emperor Tewodros in particular, I cite him as a kind of predecessor in terms of that kind of Christian nationalist imperial style. I think, you know, Eritrea better than me, of course, and so do your viewers, but you know, I've heard parallels between Isaias as well in Eritrea and the kind of that kind of imperial mode in leadership and statecraft in the region. So in that respect, he's a figure from history, but clearly he is something very new as well. I think at first, when he came to power, there was this idea that maybe he's a kind of liberal Democrat. That's not something the region's really ever known. I don't think, and I admit to making that mistake to some degree very early on. That isn't it. But in terms of, particularly in terms of style, there are kind of novel elements to his leadership. One, of course, is the Pentecostalism, and again, people. Prosperity gospel. Now, people will say, well, the Christian thing and lots of elements of the kind of Pentecostal style have precedence in the kind of Christian leadership of the emperors, but there is something different in stylistically and aesthetically as well, for sure, about the way what Abiy brings, which comes to some degree from the church that he is part of, but then also this really unusual kind of corporate CEO, kind of almost like kind of business self-help guru thing that he brings. And that's really kind of distinctively Abiy. I don't think there is no precedent in Ethiopian or regional politics for that. The kind of, and I talk about this in some of the early chapters, but that side to him, the kind of positive thinking, the idea of, well, frankly, this kind of embrace of a certain kind of capitalist and individualist ethos, and this idea of like, you can be anything that you and we, a country, can be anything we set our minds to. I don't know of any precedents really in Ethiopia in its recent, or certainly not its ancient history. So that's, I think, something he brings to the table, which is very new. But in terms of the mechanics of government, the centralizing, the micromanaging, I think he's an extreme version of something which is a characteristic of Ethiopian governance and Eritrean governance going, you know, which has never really been broken from. And I think that's partly the imperial legacy. Maybe there are other influences, the kind of Marxist-Leninist inheritance as well. All of that's in the mix as well. So I'd say yes, he's both, and to the point I made at the beginning, the way that he's kind of confounding figure. Yeah, he's both profoundly novel and new, but he's also a familiar figure in certain respects.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm pretty sure you're aware of it, that, your book has kind of created a lot of passionate argument from, either side of the argument, where some complain you are sympathizer of TPLF or whatever have you, as was the case during the active war time, Tigray war time. And so there is this question that, I've been asking people to, if there's any question that they have for you. One of the questions they asked me to ask you was that, in your view, that the remaking of Ethiopia in his own image, Abiy is more of a personalistic dictator operating with a narcissistic, yet more or less individual ambition. But however, the argument is that there is ample evidence that many, if not most, of his major political projects are decidedly extreme and ethno-nationalistic in nature. So how do you reconcile that? So he's just really, it's just the situation, the political, the geopolitical climate kind of led him where he is. So it's kind of beyond his controls. Is that, first of all, or for me, I can't say that you're making that argument, but so I thought I would just put it out there. So do you think that Abiy has no other his input is kind of minimal? It's more of, yeah, this is it. So now he's flying with the flow.
I think he has quite, and I made the argument in the book that he has quite a distinctive vision, and that he has been, the decision maker at certain key points. I don't think he is simply kind of riding the waves of history or being buffeted by forces. He is certainly, with, like any figure in history, of course, he is to some degree constrained by the context, by the historical context from which he emerges, no question about that. But I think more, probably unusually so, partly due to just the centralized that he has been, able to direct the course of the country, insofar as the Ethiopian state has remained, within his hands, and that's a different question. That's changing over time. But I think, key decisions, whether that's the decision to go to war, the biggest one out there, the choice of life and death, war and peace. These are the decisions of his alone. And I think, and hopefully I lay out in the book the way that he is not solely responsible for all the conflicts which have spawned and proliferated on his watch. But I mean, I'm afraid, when you're a figure in that position with that degree of power and centralized power at that, you can't really evade responsibility for these, for what has happened. And actually, I would say, and this is a criticism I really do have with the way his, some of his supporters argue in defense, is he gets the credit for all of the good things that have happened, whether that's the kind of remake of Addis Ababa or certain peace deals which are now maybe not so solid with, the region, or whether it's an investment project here or there. But yet, when it comes to the really big things, these are forces beyond his control, or he is responding to. No, I'm sorry, it doesn't cut. That doesn't cut it. Like, so he is clearly the decisive figure, and therefore he is the remaking of Addis Ababa is certainly his project. I absolutely credit him. Incredible.
And even I think my reading of your book is that I think even from the get-go, right, from the early days when no one knows that he would be the prime minister, but he seems that he's very, very skilled in building those relationships, paving the way for his future political career that he had in mind. So I thought it's actually a more calculated and intentional individual that kind of made sure that he found himself where he is now. So it's
yeah, that's my reading. I mean, I don't know if it will. I don't want to overstate the idea of him as a Machiavellian mastermind. I think he seizes the opportunities that are presented to him. He's very good at making. I think the point I make regularly is he, at the very least, we know he's adept at seizing opportunity out of crisis. So I don't want to say like every step he's masterminded. The state of the country now, clearly, there are forces that he cannot control. But ultimately, I do think there is a lot of intention, and I don't think and I don't think everything is simply made up on the hoof as he went along. I think we should assume a certain degree of kind of deliberateness in what's happened.
I think it's just now kind of a little bit moving into the direction with his relationship with the Eritrean leader, and also his coordination of the war in Tigray with the Eritrean regime and the involvement of the Eritrean troops, that we kind of later on actually has to be admitted by both sides after quite a lot of reporting, a lot of pressure from the international community. So how do you see, of course, I think you are one of those Ethiopians and other international figures that went to Asmara on the first flight. So just bring us to that time and how it was for you. I think you describe it very well in your book, but I wanted our audience kind of to catch a glimpse of what you said in the book. So what was it like for you and for others who were traveling with you on Ethiopian Airlines to Asmara?
Well, I would say to this day, I don't think I've had a more enjoyable and thrilling experience as a reporter than that flight to from Ethiopia to Eritrea, and the arrival in Eritrea, huge crowds. It was an incredibly emotional moment. I mean, it was to be kind of a witness to that. I felt enormously lucky and fortunate. It was an amazing thing to see. It was like the kind of fall of the Berlin Wall in the Horn of Africa. Unfortunately, it was very hard. I spent a week then in Eritrea, a bit longer than that. It was very hard, obviously, to operate there as a journalist on a practical level. You couldn't get a phone SIM card. You kind of have to, there's barely any internet, and it's all all these things. Really difficult.
Yes.
Government. I spoke to some government figures, but they're not exactly massively welcoming. What I would say, I don't think I have no reason to believe I was being massively surveilled or followed or any of those things. I was able to go to the coast, to Massawa, which was amazing. And again, I remember, I think I mentioned this in the book briefly, that moment, that week I was sort of overwhelmed with, excitement. I thought we were going to be in this new era where people would be able to fly back and forth from Addis to Massawa, go to the beach. At that point, they were talking about there was going to be a flight from Addis to Massawa opening up very soon. And it all seemed really exciting. And of course, there were cautionary voices, there were critical voices, but it was that particular week. It was pretty hard not to get swept away. But I would say the kind of in hindsight, the thing that was most telling was just the kind of demeanor of the officials I spoke to, who were very, very cautious. They were quite fixated on past wrongs, I have to say. We were mostly talking about what Ethiopia and the TPLF had done. It was much less about the future. No one seemed to want to talk about the future. The questions I asked, like, what's going to happen with national service? What's going to happen with the political system, the constitution, political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, the economy? no one had it. I was just constantly kind of just told, give us time. We need to work things out. They were taken by surprise. And I think by the speed with which things had moved forward, and I think that was because, again, it was very much a personal thing between Isaias and Abiy. It was there was no institutional involvement from the Ethiopian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or whatever institution there is in Eritrea. In theory, to be doing that, there was no involvement for any of these people. So it was in hindsight pretty telling how reluctant and how to kind of talk about the future the officials were, how much kind of dwelling on the past. Ultimately, because this wasn't a peace agreement that had been. Frankly, it wasn't a peace agreement. It was a pact between two leaders. There had been no reconciliation, no attempt to chart out a kind
normalize relation. Yeah.
Normalizing anything. So, in hindsight, and I realized this I wrote an article a year later about how the peace agreement was not being implemented and how, all the signs were really not good. But I think we should have known earlier, frankly. Well, I was just a journalist, but the Nobel Prize, for example, should have probably noticed, hang on, there's something really missing here. Really something missing.
Yeah, I think it's quite from the Eritrean circles. I mean, of course, there were Eritreans who were kind of taken aback by the new, love, Madammer, whatever have you, like, many Ethiopians have been. But I think there were many Eritrean voices were very cautious, very critical, and attempts also to